This is Dr. Ken with a lecture for my Chaucer's England class that I'm titling Challenging the Social Order. So we've so far talked about the social order, those who work, those who fight, and those who pray, and seen how the values, particularly of the upper classes, reinforce this system, and that in its ideal form it is meant to be a harmonious system with each part performing its function and a kind of heavenly harmony instilled on earth. But the reality, as it turns out, is quite different. So we've already seen the concept of mock heroism, which seems to be challenging certain ideals. We're now going to look at other, what I'm calling challenges to the social order, which again reveal this gap between the ideal and the real that satire often likes to point out. So there are several things, and some of them are not new, but I'll be going over them in a slightly different approach today. So amongst the various themes that we're considering, there is a crisis in royalty and the nobility, and I've alluded to this before. The the aristocratic infighting that takes place at every level, but particularly at the level of royalty itself. There's a lot of violence amongst the aristocracy, indicating that it's not so harmonious a social order as we might imagine. There's dissent in religion. So we have the great schism, of course. We have Lollardy and anti-clericalism, as evidenced by Chaucer's own Canterbury Tales. There are revolts amongst the peasantry, so I'll revisit the Peasants Revolt briefly again today. There's the Black Death. Obviously, that is a major challenge to the social order because it seems to have implied for many people, or to have not implied, but blatantly demonstrated that those who were in charge couldn't actually exert that much control over something like this, which was seen as an act of God. And then there's bawdiness as a concept in literature, in art, in humor. Is it challenging the social order? It's something for us to think about. So I'm not going to go over, pardon me, everything again with the monarchy, but there are clearly problems with the monarchy. We've seen how Edward II is deposed by his wife and her lover, and then later murdered by them, and then how Edward III would have to overthrow his own mother, pardon me, and then imprison and kill his mother's lover Mortimer to take over the throne. He has a fairly long reign and relatively stable, all things considered, but of course it's the 100 Years' War that kicks off thanks to Edward III. Excuse me again. I should not have tea before I lecture, but anyway. And of course Richard II, Edward's grandson, a very troubled and problematic reign that would itself be, obviously, well, it would be overthrown by Henry IV, who would become Henry IV, the son of John of Gaunt, Henry of Bolingbroke. So, apart from the long reign of Edward III, there's a succession crisis with each monarch, and of course Edward himself sparks a succession crisis in France with the 100 Years' War. And again, I'm not going to go over all this as we did before, but I'll point out just a couple of things, though, that I perhaps didn't mention. So with Edward III getting on in years, he's not able to lead the campaign into France like he would perhaps prefer. He's sending his sons, Edward the Black Prince and John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt gets involved in a kind of conflict in Spain, where he sets himself up temporarily as the King of Castile and Leon, though only temporarily. And Edward the Black Prince would lead most of the fighting in France. He gets the title the Black Prince for his rather ruthless approach. But Edward the Black Prince develops an illness, and we don't think it was plague. His health deteriorates. He returns to England in 1371. And his father, Edward III, by this point is quite elderly and in poor health. The prince's illness was debilitating, and he dies on the 8th of June, 1376. Edward only just outlived him by about a year. And then it's Richard II who succeeds Edward. This is Edward the Black Prince's son. It leaves the war in France in a kind of, and we think, by the way, that Edward the Black Prince probably died of cancer, although that's still by no means certain. But this leaves the war in France in a state of uncertainty. There's a Treaty of Bretonniere that takes place to kind of pause the fighting. However, a small professional French army under the leadership of a knight named de Guesclin pushed the English back, and by the time of Charles V's death, and Charles V was the king that Edward was challenging for the throne, he dies in 1380. The English only hold Calais, and there are heavy and unpopular taxes being imposed to try and keep it from the French. So this also would seem to challenge the social order to some extent, because the war in France was meant to be about Edward III upholding his claim to the throne of France. You know, and of course in the medieval mind, might makes right, so trial by combat is a way of determining matters, as we've seen already in the Knight's Tale. But by 1380 the war is going quite badly, and the English only hold Calais. And as I say, they're deeply unpopular there because they've taxed the people of Calais in order to pay for their own occupation. It has other destabilizing effects, this war, and in particular the periods in between the fighting, of which there are quite a few you can sort of see on the timeline. So it increases the number of trained and armed men in the community, and so, you know, as a consequence, this destabilizes the social order. You've got groups of knights, and we hear stories of people maybe about to go off and fight, or just coming back from the wars, going into abbeys and raping nuns, pillaging villages that are not protected, that sort of thing. It has this destabilizing effect in France, but certainly in England as well. Now, if you thought the reigns of the 14th century monarchs were troubled, well, it carries on into the next century as well, with Henry IV. So, John of Gaunt's son, who then comes back and deposes Richard II, he himself had a troublesome and unstable reign, fraught with conflicts all around, because many people didn't like the idea of him being king. And this illustrates this issue of infighting between the aristocracy. And it's replicated at every level down the hierarchy, where there is competition for every conceivable role you can imagine, from knight to lord to baron to duke or whatever. So Henry spent much of his reign defending himself against plots, rebellions, and assassination attempts. Rebellions continued throughout the first 10 years of his reign, including the revolt of Owen Guindier, who declared himself Prince of Wales in 1400. And then there's the rebellion of Henry Percy, first Earl of Northumberland, that takes place around this time too. The king's successes in putting down these rebellions was due partly to his military ability, and that of the skills of his eldest son Henry of Monmouth, who later became king, though the son managed to seize more or less effective power from his father from 1410, so not an untroubled reign. In the last year of Henry IV's reign, the rebellions picked up speed. The old fable of a living King Richard was revived, that somehow Richard was still alive, he hadn't died. Notes one account, and emissaries from Scotland traversed the villages of England in the last years of Henry's reign, declaring Richard was residing at the Scottish court, awaiting only a signal from his friends to repair to London and recover the throne. This sort of propaganda helped to undermine Henry's regime. Definitely a challenge to the social order from the Scots, who of course have other interests in England. A suitable looking impostor, we're told, was found, and King Richard's old groom circulated word in the city that his master was still alive in Scotland. Southwark was incited to insurrection by a man named Elias Levitt and his associate Thomas Clark, who promised the Scottish aid to carry out the insurrection. Ultimately, the rebellion came to nothing. The knight was released, Neville was released, and his followers thrown into the Tower. But these are the sorts of challenges that Henry's reign would face. Let me give you a list of other rebellions that took place around this time. So we've got the Epiphany Rising of 1400, the executions of the Earls of Kent, Huntingdon and Salisbury, and the Baron Despencer for their attempts to have Richard II restored as king takes place then. This is the year Chaucer dies as well. The Owen Guindier Rising in Wales, that's from 1400 to 1415. The Percy Rebellion from 1402 to 1408. And there were 3 attempts by the Percy family. These are the Percys of Alnwick, now Dukes of Northumberland. At the time they were Earls, and their allies, to overthrow Henry. So you have the North in a state of rebellion. There's the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, when Henry IV defeats a rebel army led by Henry Hotspur Percy, who was allied with the Welsh rebel Owen Guindier. Percy was killed in the battle by an arrow to the face. Thomas Percy, 1st Earl of Worcester, Sir Richard Venables, and Sir Richard Vernon were publicly hanged, drawn, and quartered in Shrewsbury on the 23rd of July, and their heads publicly displayed. The Earl of Northumberland fled to Scotland at that point, which is ironic considering that his family had fought against the Scots on a number of occasions, but were now allied with them. The Archbishop of York, Richard le Scrope, led a failed rebellion in northern England in 1405. He and other rebel leaders were executed. The Earl of Northumberland again fled to Scotland. There's the Battle of Bramham Moor, 1408. The Earl of Northumberland invaded northern England with Scottish and Northumbrian allies, but was defeated and killed in battle. So, what challenges the social order better than effectively a civil war? And a civil war in the north, where we are, where I am, and where most of my students are. So I'm just going to go over some of these in a little bit more detail, because I think they're quite relevant. So 1403, as I say, was the Battle of Shrewsbury, fought on the 21st of July, 1403, waged between the Lancastrian King Henry IV and the rebel army led by Henry Hotspur Percy from Northumberland. If you go to Alnwick Castle today, you can see a nice statue of Percy on his horse. I might have a picture of that actually, which I'll try and put up. The battle was fought at what's now Battlefield in Shropshire, England, some 3 miles north of the centre of Shrewsbury. The Percys had previously supported Henry IV in a war against Richard II, which ended when Henry took the throne in 1399. They subsequently supported him in Wales, early in the rebellion of Owen Guindier, and in Scotland in both negotiations and conflicts against the Scots. Henry IV had been supported by a number of wealthy landowners to whom he had promised land, money, and royal favor in return for their continued support. And when the war ended, lands in and around Cumberland promised to the Percys were instead granted to a rival, and this is the source of the conflict. The Earls of Northumberland and Worcester therefore publicly renounced their allegiance to the king. They charged him with perjury based on his claiming the throne instead of just his old lands and titles, his taxing the clergy despite having promised not to do so without consent of Parliament, imprisoning and murdering Richard II, and not permitting a free parliamentary election, and refusing to pay a just ransom requested by Owen Guindier, who was then holding Edmund Mortimer. It was a Pyrrhic victory for Henry IV, and the king's forces sustained at the Battle of Shrewsbury. The king's forces sustained considerable losses, much greater than the rebels. In fact, Henry IV very nearly lost both his life and his throne. Henry Percy was killed, which effectively ended the battle. But this is temporary. It results in a civil war effectively in the north. And this is what I was referring to earlier with the Archbishop of York, Richard Scrope, who joins Henry Percy, the 1st Earl of Northumberland, and Lord Bardolph in a rebellion in northern England. So the rebellion began with the production of a manifesto which contained a list of grievances and was placarded all over the city of York. It doesn't appear that a copy of this manifesto has survived, but its contents are referred to in a treatise by Clement Maidstone. According to the document in the manifesto, Scrope and Mowbray expressed the desire that the crown of the kingdom should be restored to the rightful line of descent, and that the clergy and commons not be oppressed by levies and taxes, and included the usual complaints about bad government. This treatise, known as the Martyrium, later added that Scrope had never intended any harm against the person of Henry IV, and that the archbishop's intention was to go to the king with some other lords in order to ask the king to redress the evils then prevailing in the kingdom, which of course is what the rebels always say, particularly if their rebellions fail. Seems as if the manifesto struck a chord with the inhabitants of Yorkshire, as it persuaded some 8,000 or 9,000 armed men to join with the rebellion. And on the 27th of May, 1405, Richard Scrope and Thomas Mowbray marched north from York with their army. Their immediate objective was Thirsk, where John Falkenberg was raising further men, but it seems that the ultimate intention was to join forces with Henry Percy, who together with Thomas Bardolph was on his way from Northumberland with many of his followers. Naturally, Henry IV could not allow this revolt to go unchallenged, and dispatched Ralph Neville, Earl of Westmoreland, together with his second son John, to deal with this rising in the north. After a short engagement at Topcliffe near Thirsk, Ralph Neville rapidly dispersed John Falkenberg's forces before swinging south to meet the rebels from York. Once Percy realized that there was a royal army standing between him and his Yorkshire allies, he decided to return north to his stronghold in Northumberland and await events. So on the 29th of May, when Richard Scrope and Thomas Mowbray were at Shipton Moor, some 5.5 miles north of York, they found themselves confronted by Ralph Neville and could go no further. Nothing much happened for the next 3 days as the two sides uneasily glowered at each other over the moor until Richard Scrope, ignoring the protestations of Thomas Mowbray, agreed to talks with Ralph Neville. Neville and Scrope agreed on a truce, and somehow Neville managed to persuade the good archbishop that under the terms of the truce that he should order his men to return home. Scrope's naivety was soon demonstrated, as once the rebel army had dispersed, Neville ordered both Scrope and Mowbray seized and imprisoned. They were initially taken to Pontefract Castle, where they remained until the arrival of Henry IV on the 3rd of June. They were then taken to the archbishop's house at Bishopthorpe, just south of York itself. As Henry considered their guilt as self-evident from their conduct, he decided to dispense with the formality of the trial, and resolved that Scrope and Mowbray should both be executed as traitors at York. Therefore, on the morning of Monday, the 8th of June, 1405, Henry ordered William Gascoigne, the Chief Justice of England, to pronounce the death sentence against the two conspirators. To his credit, Gascoigne refused to condemn Richard Scrope, correctly pointing out that the civil authorities had no jurisdiction over a bishop. However, Henry simply called in another judge by the name of William Fulthorpe, who had fewer scruples and was prepared to deliver the required sentence of death. With the necessary judgment now delivered on the very same day, the two condemned men were taken to the field just outside the city walls for execution. As the 8th of June happened to be the feast of St. William of York, and therefore a holiday in the city, this guaranteed a good crowd for the event. Both Mowbray and Scrope were beheaded. Thomas Mowbray was reported to have shown some natural fear of death at the prospect, whilst Scrope, as befitted an archbishop, bore his fate with a greater degree of equanimity. The executioner for the day was a man named Thomas Allman, who had been a prisoner of some 15 years in York, who was promised his freedom as payment for his day's work. Thomas Mowbray's head was later displayed on a stake at Bootham Bar within the city, whilst the rest of him was buried at Greyfriars Church, but Richard Scrope's remains were simply interred at York Minster. And this is what's going on in the north at this time, and alongside it we've got the rebellion of Owen Guindier, that's 1408. Henry, Prince of Wales, retook Aberystwyth from Owen Guindier, defeated him. In March, the Welsh surrender at Harlech Castle to the English. And I think it's from this point, effectively, that the heir to the throne will henceforward be called the Prince of Wales, and thus sort of removing what was left of the Welsh aristocracy. But a deeply troubled reign Henry IV would have. So yeah, it's problematic, and this clearly there's a crisis between the aristocracy and the nobility going on. Uh, Sometimes nobles could be too rich and powerful for the king to act against them alone. So it shouldn't. It's not supposed to work like that. You know, we have the hierarchy: kings on top, his tenants in chief, the gentry under him, etc. But in actual fact, some nobles are incredibly rich and powerful and can resist the king. Um, and they were not always the rigorous upholders of the law. And we have lots of fights and skirmishes as well as lawsuits going on and being a frequent occurrence between members of the aristocracy. Um, so far from being a stable social order, it is a highly unstable system that sort of maintains itself. I mean, there's a kind of equilibrium maintained, although it's a very dynamic equilibrium, and it sometimes bursts its bounds, if you like, and explodes into all-out civil war. So I'll give you an example of one of these, which concerns, again, the northern barons. It's the Dilson Dispute. So this is an example of a court case amongst members of the aristocracy that spills over into actual fighting. So this involves the Claxton and Tynedale families, and it occurs from about 1370 to 1440, so it's a long, protracted dispute over the barony of Dilston and the rest of the inheritance of the Tynedale family, which began near the end of Edward III's reign and continued into the first phase of in its first phase to 1399. There's an interlude of about 25 years before the second phase of the dispute starts abruptly in the mid-1420s and then continues until its final resolution in about 1441. The reasons for the second phase of the dispute are more difficult to account than the first. The first was over who got to inherit some land. But both ultimately stemmed from a dysfunctional marriage between Walter Tynedale and Isabel Lilburne, and a contest about legitimacy into which the Claxton family were drawn. As must have been expected, opposing parties applied all the influence at their disposal to promote their respective positions. Initially, the Claxtons relied on support of their good lords, the Nevilles of Raby, or Raby rather, and Brantspeth in the Palatinate of Durham, whilst their opponents counted on the powerful Percy family, the Earls of Northumberland. In a way, it's a kind of war by proxy between the Percys and the Nevilles. The final settlement following the realignment and that conflict between the two would carry on, by the way, for a long time. I'll put up some pictures of Raby Castle. They were good Catholics and remained Catholic probably even after the Reformation, whereas the Percys went over to Anglicanism a bit more obviously. But that's well in the future. This conflict between these two houses will continue. So the final settlement followed the realignment of political allegiance in the north after the death of Ralph Neville, 1st Earl of Westmoreland, and the subsequent estrangement between the senior and junior branches of the family. The Claxtons sided with the senior branch represented by Ralph, 2nd Earl of Westmoreland, and were reconciled to the Earl of Northumberland along with the senior Nevilles. The first phase, from 1374 to 1399, was fairly typical. Dispute over legitimacy of rights played out in the courts, though not without its share of involvement from the higher ups. The second phase, from 1425 until 1441, was much more a contest over territorial hegemony, with right and legitimacy used as a pretext for violence in the furtherance of factional interest. Most of the central characters involved were local gentry and nobility. Analysis of the Dilston dispute augments our understanding of the extent to which those pillars of local authority, the country gentry, were prepared to use their authority in the ruthless pursuit of their own interests. And what I mean by this, by violence, is that gangs of bullies were often sent by both sides into the territory of the other. In some cases into some of the villages like Corbridge Bridge, which you see pictured in the slide, which was part of one of the estates that was disputed, and so people would go in there sent by one side or the other to stir up trouble, and it burst out into full fighting on some occasions. if you like, a house minor or two houses minor, with houses major being involved, by proxy. And this again illustrates an issue with the social order. And it's not the only one. There is a sense of lawlessness in the northeast of England. In fact, it's sometimes called the lawless north. It's sometimes seen as and is in fact a border country in an almost permanent state of war. When they're not fighting each other, the various nobles in the region are fighting the Scots and sometimes the king. And we have the Nevilles at Raby and the Percys at Alnwick in contest, sometimes allied with each other, sometimes fighting each other, sometimes fighting by proxy, as we've seen in the case of the Dilson Dispute. Northumbria was resistant to central government from about the 11th century up to the 18th century. So there's a long tradition of the Northeast being a kind of separate, almost a separate kingdom within a kingdom. And this is why we get the Palatinate of Durham set up ostensibly to shore up the king's control in the north. Sometimes this region, in Northumbria in particular, is referred to as an earldom outside the crown, the kingdom of Northumbria up until 1157, really. And as I say, we have, even later on, going into the 16th century, you've got the Pilgrimage of Grace, which I won't go into now because I know some of you will be getting that in another class, but that involved a kind of almost an uprising, a civil war almost in the north. And then there's the rising in the north of 1569, also called the Revolt of the Northern Earls or Northern Rebellions, and this would go on. This was over Elizabeth I and, Mary Queen of Scots. There was sympathy in this region for the Jacobites in Scotland. But I mentioned the Prince Bishops. So William II, William the Conqueror's heir, realized that there needed to be some kind of official control in the north to keep it under control, in addition to those lords that were in charge. So William the Conqueror, shortly after the conquest, appointed Bishop Walker of Durham, Earl Bishop of Northumbria. The appointment concentrated both secular and spiritual power over the whole of the northeast of England in the hands of one person. But then Walker gets murdered by an angry mob at Gateshead in 1081 because people in the north resent his royal authority. So the king then decided to continue with this policy, but in a more limited way. He then elevated Bishop Caerleff and subsequent bishops to the rank of Prince Bishop, giving them vice-regal power over an area that became known as the Palatinate of Durham. So initially, the Earl Bishop was meant to be over all of Northumbria. That didn't work out very well because of different groups within Northumbria that resisted the authority. But the second attempt is to create the Prince Bishops of Durham, a slightly smaller territory, but still a large one, and giving the Prince Bishops a great deal of power. And this is referred to the Palatinate of Durham, which covers much of the modern counties of what used to be Cleveland, Durham, and Tyne and Wear, together with parts of the county of Northumberland. A kind of, if you like, planted, right in the middle of the heart of the region, a power base for the king. The secular power of the Prince Bishop is well symbolized by the illuminated initial from the Bible of Richard Pudsey, which I put on the screen for you to see. There. A century later, boasting of the power of his master, the steward of Bishop Beck once claimed, this is in 1284, so a bit after that, he says, "There are two kings in England, namely the Lord King of England wearing a crown in sign of his regality, and the Lord Bishop of Durham wearing a mitre in place of a crown in sign of his regality in the Diocese of Durham." But that's the attitude, that it's almost like there are two kings. And indeed, the Prince Bishops lived like kings in their castles or palaces at Durham City and Bishop Auckland. The Prince Bishops had similar royal powers within the Palatinate to those of the king, which the king exercised over the whole kingdom. Not only did they have their own parliaments, Durham sent no representatives to London, they also could raise their own armies, levy their own taxes rather, mint their own coins, and set up their own court system. At the high point of their powers, the prince-bishops could even enter in negotiations directly with the kings of Scotland, create their own barons, and negotiate commerce by granting charters for markets and fairs. So it's like a miniature version of the kingdom replicated in the Palatinate of Durham. And again, it's meant to be a stabilizing feature in the north to try and prevent or control the lawlessness and rebellion that's going on there. I suppose it does to a point, but then sometimes it doesn't. Bishop von Mildert, 1826 to 36, was the last of the prince bishops. He was involved in the founding of Durham University in 1832. Durham Castle, which had always been the principal stronghold and palace of the prince bishops, was handed over in 1837 to provide a home for the new university. Since then, the main seat of the bishops of Durham has been at Auckland Castle, just a few miles south of Durham. It was only with the death of Bishop van Mildert in 1836 that the secular powers of the bishops of Durham were finally surrendered to the king. Interestingly, though, the Palatinate court system survived for almost another century and a half. It wasn't until 1971 that the system finally merged into the English court structure, exactly 900 years after William the Conqueror appointed Bishop Walker as Earl Bishop of Northumbria. So quite a long history, the Palatinate of Durham, and you get a sense that with Durham, with the Nevilles of Raby and the Percys of Alnwick and the Earls of Westmoreland, there are these different factions in the north that pretty much see themselves as independent of the crown. What does this say for the social order? Let me go over briefly three major battles that took place in the northeast in particular, which again illustrate the instability of this region during the 14th century. So we have the Battle of Borough Bridge. That was fought on the 16th of March, 1322, between a group of rebellious barons and Edward II. This was a challenge to his reign. Near Boroughbridge, northwest of York. The culmination of a long period of antagonism between the king and Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, his most powerful subject. It resulted in Lancaster's defeat and execution. This allowed Edward to reestablish royal authority and hold on to power for another 5 years, but it illustrates the troubled nature of his reign. Not in itself a part of the wars of Scottish independence, the battle is significant for its employment of tactics learned in the Scottish wars in a domestic English conflict. So tactics they've learned fighting the Scots, they now apply English against English. Both the exhaustive use of foot soldiers rather than cavalry and the heavy impact caused by the longbow represent significant steps in military development. The next one is the Battle of Neville's Cross in 1346. This took place at Neville's Cross between the Scottish and English forces on the 17th of October, 1346, on moorland just to the west of Durham. Two armies clashed on the narrow ridge close to Neville's Cross. The English had already chosen the best ground before the Scots could assemble their army, and so the invaders found themselves severely disadvantaged by the terrain. Despite the battle being evenly balanced for a time, the Scots were outmaneuvered and gradually fled the field, all but abandoning their king. This was a disastrous battle for the Scots. Not only was their king captured and imprisoned, and many men lost, but the following year the English pursued their advantage and were able to occupy almost the whole of Scotland south of the Forth and Clyde. So push up into Scotland. The Scots, so on the 7th of October, the Scots had entered England. This is talking about the battle itself, with about 12,000 men. They were expecting to find the north of England undefended because Edward III was then conducting a major campaign in France, so they expected the armies to be away fighting in France. Philippe VI of France went so far as to characterize northern England as a defenseless void. Unfortunately, King David II's strategic and tactical abilities were not up to the task of making good use of the Scots' element of surprise. Perhaps, though, they didn't feel the need for haste. After taking Liddesdale and bypassing Carlisle, apparently Carlisle bribed them on this occasion not to attack. The Scots moved on toward their ultimate goal of Durham and Yorkshire after more than a week's march. Along the way, they sacked the Priory of Hexham and burned the territory around their line of march, not unlike what the English were doing in France at the time. They arrived at Durham on the 16th of October and encamped at Beaurepaire, where the Scots were offered £1,000. That's equivalent roughly to £500,000 in 2011, probably a bit more today. The Scots only discovered the presence of the English army, though they refused the bribe, on the morning of the 17th of October. Troops under the command of William Douglas stumbled upon them in the morning, and during the raid, during morning mist during the raid south of Durham. The two rearward divisions of the English army drove the Scots off with heavy casualties, as I say. So this was a loss, a defeat for the Scots. Unfortunately, the English had been prepared for them on that occasion, but again, it illustrates just how unstable the North was. And then the last one that I'll mention is the Battle of Otterburn in 1388. This took place on the 5th of August, 1388, as part of the continuing border skirmishes between the Scottish and the English. The best remaining record of the battle comes from Jean Froissart's chronicles, in which he claims to have interviewed veterans from both sides of the battle. So that's interesting if it's true. We have eyewitness accounts from this battle. His accounts is still regarded with some concern, though, as details such as the distance between Newcastle upon Tyne and Otterburn are incorrect. We can perhaps forgive him for not knowing those details. He was in London a lot of the time. Froissart, he might not have traveled this far north. Anyway, the Scottish James Douglas, 2nd Earl of Douglas, decided to lead the raid into English territory. It was time to take advantage of divisions of the English side between the Nevilles and the Percys, so related back to that conflict. Henry Percy, 1st Earl of Northumberland, had just taken over defense of the border. He was warden of the north, if you like, meant to protect against the Scots. During the battle on a moonlit night, Douglas was killed, and the Percys were both captured, with the remaining English forces retreating to Newcastle. Despite the Percy's force having an estimated 3-to-1 advantage over the Scots, Froissart records that 1,040 English were captured and a further 1,860 were killed, whereas only 200 Scots were captured and 100 were killed. Another source, the Westminster Chronicler, gives a more reliable estimate of Scottish casualties being around 500 or so. When the Bishop of Durham advanced from Newcastle with 10,000 men, he was so impressed by the ordered appearance of the Scottish forces, the din they set up on their horns, and their seemingly unassailable position, that he declined to attack. So Otterburn was a success story for the Scots, again with captured individuals having to be ransomed off. But this is all happening, and that was in Edward III's reign. This one, I think. No, this might have been this was in Richard II's reign. So all three of the monarchs of the 14th century have very troubled reigns, with battles taking place in our part of England, in the northeast of England. Other challenges to the social order. We've mentioned before the kind of sort of two-type model of knights, and so Chaucer presents his knight in the Canterbury Tales, as a very positive and pious individual. And as I said, I think in the seminar, that there's a two-type model here. There are those knights who are going to inherit their father's estates. They've got land and income. They can afford to be chivalric. They can afford to be courtly. And then we've got the other kind of knights, the ones who are maybe second or third sons or fourth sons, who are never going to inherit anything, but they have the title of knight. They have to make a living for themselves, and they're the ones who end up getting involved in the mercenary companies. So if we compare Chaucer's knight with what Terry Jones in his book Medieval Lives writes about them, we see a twofold model, or at least a contrasting model. So and he characterizes knights as mostly mercenaries, and I think he's had to sort of backpedal on that position to a point, because not all knights were mercenaries, but certainly a large number were. So Chaucer characterizes the knight as being, upholding the value of truth, and trustworthiness. Jones says, well, he'll honor pledges to anyone who employs him, but only if they're paying him more than someone else. Freedom is a characteristic, or liberality, and that knights that Chaucer says they should have. Jones calls this independence or license. That is to say, the knight will do pretty much as he pleases. Chaucer gives the knight the quality of honor, which Wright, another source, associates with fame. Jones says, well, this is about worldly glory. This is about what fame they can get for themselves, not for the sake of honor. Chaucer gives the characteristic of courtesy as a quality of the knight, or courteousness. Jones says, well, it's politeness and charm, but only to get whatever they want. So they're charming when they want to be. Chaucer describes the knight going out on campaign for a noble cause, whereas Terry Jones says acts of piracy and pillage were conducted away from the main army. And again, the fact is, I think both are right. Certain knights do fit the image that Chaucer puts forward, whereas others perhaps fit the image of Terry Jones's knight. Having said that, it's worth pointing out that Chaucer's knight is not unproblematic, or at least the missions that he's been on aren't. So most of the battles that Chaucer listed for his knight were ones that didn't look terribly honorable. The fact that Chaucer included dishonorable battles from the Crusades in the knight's description could lead one to believe that Chaucer didn't really favor the Crusades. It might be his views on this. And by making his knight a potentially dishonorable crusader, he might be trying to draw his audience's attention to the contradiction between what chivalry and honor is supposed to stand for, and what was really happening during the later Crusades. So some of these are crusades into Christendom, and I mentioned, I'll come to one of these in a moment, but I'll talk about the Siege of Alexandria. Pardon me, first of all, this is one where Chaucer's knight is meant to be involved. So the Alexandrian Crusade occurred in October of 1365. It was led by King Peter I of Cyprus against Alexandria. It was almost completely devoid of any religious pretext, and it was about mainly putting Peter I on the throne of Alexandria, taking it away from a Muslim caliph. It was unsuccessful in the end, and it was mostly about, as I say, it was a land grab. What Peter I came away with was essentially money and wealth sacked from. He couldn't hold Alexandria, but he took quite a bit of wealth from it. The other one, Prussia, that's one of the crusades the knights have been on. It was a series of 13th century campaigns, which was interesting because that would mean this knight was very old. But anyway, I mean, in the fictional sort of setting of the Canterbury Tales, I suppose it's possible. But the Prussian Crusades were a series of 13th century campaigns of Roman Catholic crusaders, primarily led by the Teutonic Knights, to Christianize the pagan Old Prussians. They were invited after earlier unsuccessful expeditions against the Prussians by the Polish princes. The Teutonic German knights began campaigning against the Balts in 1230. By the end of the century, having endured several Prussian uprisings, the knights had established control over Prussia and administered the Prussians through their monastic state. And we know that some 50,000 French as well as German children were captured and sold into slavery. Rus, this is one of the campaigns Chaucer's knights involved in. This seems to refer to the northern crusades into Prussia, but which spilled over into Russian territory. So the crusade into Christendom, which is a lot more problematic than the first, second, or even the third crusade prompted by the popes. Algeciras is another one. This was a port city in the south of Spain, the largest city on the Bay of Gibraltar. After many centuries of Muslim rule, and the tide of reconquest arrived in July of 1309. Ferdinand IV of Castile laid siege to Algeciras, as well as Gibraltar. The latter fell into Christian hands, but Muslim Algeciras held on for the following 3 decades until Alfonso the 11th of Castile resumed the siege in 1344. Sultan Abu Hassan al-Bin Othman lost the city, which was conquered by the Crusaders. Jean Nunez de Lara, Jean Miguel, Pedro Fernandez de Castro, Jean Alonso de la Garda, Lord of Gibraleon, there we go, all participated in the siege, as did knights from France, England, and Germany, and even King Philip III of Navarre, King Escort of Navarre, who came accompanied by 100 horsemen and 300 infantry. In March of 1344, after several years of bloody siege, Algeciras surrendered. It was, however, retaken by the Moors in 1368, but was then destroyed on the orders of Muhammad V of Granada. The site was subsequently abandoned, but was refounded in 1704 by refugees from Gibraltar after the Anglo-Dutch conquest. But this is what Chaucer's Knight was involved in. Balmiri is another one. This is a Spanish city prominent in the Christian Spaniards' crusade against the Moors, but which was really part of an ongoing struggle between Spanish nobles. Balmiri it's interesting that the knight was there, because this actually refers to a secret mission undertaken by Chaucer in 1366. We know that not only were the French king and Henry of Trastamara allied against Peter the Cruel in 1365-6, but also the Pope and the King of Aragon, through whose territory the army would have to pass. Chaucer's travel to Catalonia is concentrated on the word secrecy in order to give an explanation for his mission there. The arrangements to pay the mercenary companies and to plan the entrance into Spain through Catalonia were secret. So this is part of the English crown's involvement in a war in Spain, which also pulls in some of the other players of the 100 Years' War. How secret was the mission can be judged by the fact that when Peter IV, laid the plan for a joint invasion of Castile before the Catalan Parliament at Barcelona in the middle of 1365, the members were first sworn not to reveal anything. It was said, perhaps it was also in the interest of secrecy that the purpose of the invasion was concealed under the cloak of a crusade against the Moors in the south, although this may have been, as has been suggested, only a pretext to secure the collaboration of the Pope and the financial support of the Church. And again, we've got 2 popes, so it'll be the Italian one. Chaucer's secret mission was probably to deliver Edward III's letter, or perhaps, as one author suggests, was the safe conduct by Charles II. His safe conduct by Charles II wasn't as an agent of the crown, was to involve the English crown in this conflict more directly. So money, mercenaries, and we know John of Gaunt would be involved here. So the discussions had to be carried out with great secrecy at length in the earlier stages in order not to give Peter the Cruel warning of his impending danger. Chaucer may have joined the forces of Henry of Trastamara, and it's also significant that Chaucer's view of Spain was out of a country to go on a crusade against the Moors, if we take the Spanish geographical references in the Canterbury Tales to be true, and so other places are mentioned in Spain too. So this is interesting, and it alludes to something wider that Chaucer knew about that we don't. And his secret missions, whatever they were, and eventually it would entail putting John of Gaunt on the crown of Spain. So in the wider sense, this is a challenge to the social order, as pretty much the 100 Years' War was as well, and it casts a different sort of light on Chaucer's Knight, although he may have, he was just maybe following orders. It's not to say that he was involved in enslaving children or land grabs, dishonorable crusades. He seems to be a very positive character, but again, Chaucer he's given us the possibility to interpret the knight in a couple of different ways, and depending on who's reading or having this read to them, they might see it differently. And certainly Chaucer would know more about this and his secret mission to Spain than the rest of us. So in addition, these are, I've been going through effectively challenges to the social order amongst those who fight. There are obviously numerous ones amongst those who prey as well, and not the least of which being this crisis in religion. We've got Wycliffe and the Lollards. We've got the death of numerous priests as a result of the plague. There's the great schism in the church. The church's interference in people's lives. We'll be talking about that more in detail a bit later on, but you gather already from this point the church interferes a lot in people's lives, alongside the wealth and corruption of clerical individuals. And we can see this present in a number of Chaucer's characters as well. I'll talk a little bit about John Wycliffe. I've already discussed him in some detail, but it's worth pointing out that Wycliffe and the Lollards are initially favored by the regime. We have Wycliffe entering the royal service in 1374, connected with John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. His association with John of Gaunt probably dates back to 1371, and his ideas on lordship and church wealth, expressed in a treatise by Wycliffe called De Civili Dominio, on civil dominion, caused in 1377 his first official condemnation by Pope Gregory X, who censured 19 articles of it. Some of these ideas will have been appealing to the crown. The idea the church doesn't need so much wealth. Well, if the church doesn't have it, who's going to get it? The crown would. So it doesn't quite play out in the same way as Henry VIII's Reformation, but you can see a rift developing between aristocracy and the church. But what happens going from the end of the 14th century going into the 15th century is that the teachings of Wycliffe consistently get condemned by the Pope and others within the church, and Wycliffe himself is placed under house arrest in 1377. But because he's promoting the idea of the English language, an English Bible, this really appeals to the likes of Edward III and his followers. And so Lollardy gets some patronage for a time. It is only temporary, and after the Peasants Revolt of 1381, which seems to have been partly led by a Lollard priest, they fall out of favor with the aristocracy. So in some ways, Lollardy could be seen as a kind of premature Reformation. Certainly many of the ideas of the Lollards would be relevant to the later reformers. My teaching assistant has come to have her tuppence on the Lollards. Do you have a view on the Lollards, Ben? Okay, all right, thanks for that. So, as I was saying, for a while they get royal patronage, but then they lose it, with the Lollards increasingly coming under fire, and as you can see from some of the images on the screen, they suffered quite badly, unfortunately, a number of them being burned, put to death. It would be a short-lived kind of proto-Reformation. So after their support evaporates, and with John of Gaunt going off to Spain to try and set himself up on the throne of Castile and Leon, they would be persecuted into the 15th century. Amongst other things, they challenge the doctrine of transubstantiation. They are against the need for a priest to intercede on behalf of their parishioners for confession. They believe the clergy should live on tithes and voluntary contributions only. As I say, promoted the Bible in English. Is Chaucer's poor parson a Lollard? This is a subject of much debate. We've looked at the parson's prologue. We'll look at him again a bit later on for his tale, which is actually a sermon in prose on the 7 deadly sins. And he seems to have a number of qualities that are consistent with the Lollards. And he gets called one, in fact, by the shipman. Does that make him one? I don't know. And we'll talk about that a bit more and see what we think about this. And is Chaucer, because of course his patron is also John of Gaunt, and he knows John of Gaunt favors the Lollards, for a time. So, is that what's coming out? Was it too radical, though, for the 14th century? Possibly. They weren't perhaps ready, despite the Great Schism, despite these other challenges to those who pray in their place in the hierarchy. They perhaps weren't prepared for something that dramatic. Obviously, one of the biggest challenges to the social order is the Black Death. We have a quote. There's some graffiti, and you can see the image of it there, from St. Mary's Church in Ashwell, Hertfordshire. This is written on the wall in 1350. It says, "Miserable, savage, crazed, only the worst of people remain as witnesses, and to cap all came a tempest with St. Mar thundering over the earth." So this is someone's response, someone's reaction to this plague and so many people dying. That shakes up the entire social order. That is probably the biggest factor in challenging the feudal system and leading to its eventual dissolution, at least in England and Wales and Scotland. I mean, the church is badly affected by this, of course. Lots of priests die. But looking at the population, and we don't know the exact figures, but I have a breakdown roughly, which you can see on the slide. 7 million people in 1300. That's about as many people in England and Wales as you would find in Sweden today. So quite a large population for the Middle Ages. 6 million in 1340, 3 million in 1400, 2.2 million by 1520. That's with subsequent outbreaks of the Black Death. It takes a long time for the population to recover. So, with that many people gone, it's going to upset the social order in a big way. And what are the consequences of this? Well, the value of labor increases because there are fewer people to do the labor. Women are required to work on the land for the first time. Feudal services and feudal obligations become much more difficult to enforce, and spare money is available for people who survive for purchases of luxuries and material goods. Religion reflects a kind of obsession with death during this period. We'll be looking at and you can see some of the doom images in the pictures that I'm showing here. There's a decline in quality of the clergy and a gradual disappearance of the three estates. And one, I'd say direct, but it's one of several consequences, or one of several causes of this. We have the Peasants Revolt, which we've already looked at, of 1381, and the Black Death and its influence on labor, the cost of labor, that sort of thing, has an impact here. Certainly the Peasants Revolt in and of itself, I'll put a lot more detail in the notes, which you can look at, and we've already talked about this anyway, pardon me, but that is it's a direct challenge to the social order. The very idea of peasants, kicking out royal officials, burning tax offices, going into London, killing the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. This is unheard of, it's unprecedented, and it's a sign of the times. So the social order is being challenged, and this is why we think of the 14th century really as the cusp of modernity, or early modern times, and the death of the feudal system. It would certainly be not gone, but heavily revised into a more early modern form by the end of the next century. So I'll not talk further about the Peasants' Revolt, as we've done it already. I put a quote up from Piers Plowman. This is another treatise in English that's more or less contemporary with Chaucer. And what's interesting is there were several versions of this, we know. The one that we have may not have been, well, it wasn't the first one, and it seems to have been revised, so it's not clear if this had something to do with a kind of almost like a peasant's manifesto initially, but then gets co-opted, because what the version that we have does is sort of condemn those peasants, those serfs who are trying to better their lot in life. It condemns them as being grasping and greedy, and praises the simple peasant who doesn't revolt and doesn't try to leave his manor for better pay and things like that. It becomes almost like a party political propaganda piece for the establishment. We can look more closely at that, and of course Piers Plowman is one of the sources that you may or may not choose to use in your essay writing. Interestingly, I think I've mentioned this before, that Piers Plowman was the name of a person who was accused of starting the Peasants Revolt, and there were writs against him, warrants for his arrest. It's not clear whether there was actually such a person, or whether the authorities just believed there was, perhaps as a result of one of the earlier forms of this book, which may have actually encouraged them to revolt. A lot is uncertain about this, but it's interesting that it comes around this time. It's a religious piece on for peasants. So for the seminar, for those of us who are in it, for those of you who aren't, watching this for whatever reasons that I can't fathom, who aren't in my class, we're going to be doing the Miller's Tale and the Cook's Tale and their prologues. We'll also look at Chaucer's retractions. He includes a number of these, as sort of covering his own rear end to make sure he's not offended someone. And I've put also in the reader for your consideration the 12 conclusions of the Lollards, and a chronology of the Peasants' Revolt, to think about their aims and how radical they were, both the Lollards and the Peasants' Revolt, because these are challenges to the social order. There are a lot more challenges to the social order. I've gone over material ones that I can evidence, but you could certainly find many others. So thank you very much for your attention, and I shall see you next time.